In this short video, we're going to look at Porter's competitive advantage of nations. Now, this is sometimes referred to as Porter's diamond. In the 1980s, the Japanese motor manufacturers gained a strong market share in the USA and Europe, and the competitive advantage of nations framework goes a long way to explaining why this was possible. The diagram that Porter used has four main elements. These are the factor conditions, which we'll talk about in more detail in a moment, the home demand conditions, the firm strategy, structure and rivalry, and the related and supporting industries. Now these all interrelate, which gives the diagram its form of the pattern made of a diamond, hence the term Porter's diamond. In economics, we learn that there are several factors that give what we call comparative advantage to a country. For example, a nation or country that has an abundance of low-cost labour is likely to have a global advantage in trading in labour-intensive goods, whereas a capital-rich country, which has access to capital such as plant and equipment, will have an advantage in capital-intensive goods. So this is what we call a comparative advantage. Now, under factor conditions, these would typically be land, labour and capital. Now these are the basic factors, and it could be argued that nations either have these or they don't. However, Porter identified advanced factors such as education, infrastructure and telecommunications, which are broadened out here as technology. These are factors that governments can invest in within their nation. The Japanese government had been investing in education, so had an educated workforce, and also, it could be argued, a more sophisticated and educated consumer market. Educating the workers means that you can't help but educate the consumer, as they're often the very same people. The government had also invested in the infrastructure, so this includes roads, rail networks, airports and seaports. So if you can get goods into and out of, as well as around the country quickly and effectively, it gives you an advantage over nations that can't. Finally, Japan had invested in new technology both for telecommunications and also manufacturing technology. Therefore, Japan as a nation had an abundance of what Porter determined the advanced factors. If we focus on the motor manufacturing industry, two of the major components of raw materials of motor cars are steel and microelectronics. Japan was, at the time, a world leader in the production of steel and microelectronics. The motor industry therefore had access to domestically produced high-quality components. They were not having to import them, so the supporting industries were world leaders in their field, and the motor manufacturers could move their raw materials and component goods around the country very efficiently via the infrastructure. So the operation of things like just-in-time and robotics was very, very useful for the motor manufacturing industry. As I've just alluded to, the use of high technology production and robotics was also possible. So again, we can see that the presence of advanced factors aided the competitive advantage of the industry. There were also a few motor manufacturers in Japan, so the structure of the industry was very, very competitive, which meant that manufacturers were always trying to improve quality and remain competitive in terms of cost. In terms of the demand conditions in the domestic market, they were also very competitive as the market became saturated and manufacturers tried to compete to gain market share by producing even higher quality, more fuel efficient cars at lower prices. So all of these factors helped the motor manufacturers in Japan become very, very competitive in a global market. So, when a domestic market becomes saturated, the most logical way to expand your market share is to export to overseas markets. And this is what the Japanese car manufacturers did. But due to the factors that were present in the domestic Japanese market in this industry, when their cars were launched onto the USA and European markets, the Japanese cars were of much better quality, more fuel efficient and actually cost less. So most of this can be put down to particular factors that were present in Japan at the time that favoured car manufacturers in that country. i.e. it gave the manufacturers of motor cars in Japan a competitive advantage in the global market. However, as you might expect, there were other factors that affected this. For example, in 1976 there was an oil crisis that pushed the cost of fuel up so that demand for large cars reduced in Western economies. And the Japanese cars were much smaller and more fuel efficient, so it could be argued they launched into the USA and Europe at the right time. An interesting aspect of this story is that initially the Japanese manufacturers exported to the USA and Europe rather than setting up factories. If you think about it, if they had set up factories straight away, they would have lost their competitive advantage, which derived largely from the fact that they were building cars in Japan, i.e. the elements of the diamond that were favourable to motor manufacturing in Japan at the time provided the global advantage. It was much later, once market share was established, that they began to assemble cars in the UK.